The rain-slicked streets of Manhattan in early January 2026 provided a somber backdrop to the legal firestorm that had just ignited within the halls of the state Supreme Court. For decades, the name Donnie McClurkin had been synonymous with redemption. He was the man who had turned a brutal childhood into a Grammy-winning gospel career, a pastor who stood as a pillar of the community in Long Island, and a global voice for those seeking to reconcile their faith with their personal struggles. But as the clock struck noon on Friday, January 2nd, the narrative of a delivered saint began to fracture under the weight of a meticulously detailed lawsuit. The plaintiff, Giuseppe Corletto, now in his 40s, stepped into the light not as a disgruntled former employee, but as a man seeking to reclaim a decade of his life that he claimed was stolen by the very man he once worshipped as a spiritual father. The allegations contained within the filing were not merely of professional misconduct, but of a systematic, years-long pattern of grooming, spiritual manipulation, and sexual violence that allegedly occurred under the guise of deliverance. The story begins in 2003, a time when the gospel music industry was dominated by McClurkin's soaring vocals and his autobiography, Eternal Victim, Eternal Victor. For a 21-year-old Corletto, the book was a lifeline. He was a young man struggling to reconcile his sexuality with a deep traditional faith, a conflict that had left him feeling isolated and broken. When he read McClurkin's words describing how God had helped him overcome the curse of homosexuality, Corletto saw a blueprint for his own survival. He saw a man who had walked through the same fire of childhood abuse and poverty and had emerged clean on the other side. Driven by a desperate hope for change, Corletto traveled to McClurkin's Perfecting Faith Church in Long Island. He sat in the pews, listening to the pastor speak of his own trauma, of being raped by an uncle at the age of 8, and felt a connection that was almost magnetic. He wasn't just a fan, he was a seeker. When he was finally introduced to McClurkin after a church event, the interest the pastor took in him felt like divine intervention. To the outside world, what followed looked like a textbook mentorship. By 2004, Corletto had become McClurkin's personal assistant, a role that placed him at the center of the gospel star's world. He was the one who handled the logistics, the one who traveled on private jets and stayed in 5-star hotels, and the one who stood in the wings while McClurkin moved thousands to tears with songs of grace. But according to the lawsuit, the private reality was a dark inversion of the public image. The transition from mentor to predator was subtle, a process Corletto now identifies as classic grooming. It began, the lawsuit alleges, during Pray the Gay Away spiritual sessions. In the sanctity of these private moments, where Corletto was at his most vulnerable and seeking deliverance, the lines of physical touch began to blur. What started as spiritual laying on of hands allegedly devolved into groping. Corletto describes a profound sense of biblical manipulation that kept him tethered to his abuser. McClurkin allegedly drew parallels between their relationship and that of the biblical prophets Elijah and Elisha, a bond where the mentee's very salvation and spiritual mantle were dependent on their absolute devotion to the mentor. For a young man who believed his deliverance was wrapped up in McClurkin's presence, the idea of leaving wasn't just a career move, it felt like a rejection of God himself. By 2007, the alleged abuse had escalated from grooming to physical assault. One specific incident cited in the legal documents took place during a trip to California. Despite McClurkin traveling with his then-girlfriend, a detail the lawsuit suggests served as a public cover, Corletto alleges he was raped in a hotel room. When he later confronted McClurkin about the violation, the response was a masterclass in gaslighting. The pastor allegedly claimed he was on medication and had no memory of the event, ultimately shifting the blame onto Corletto and leaving him in a state of intense shame and confusion. The duality of McClurkin's life during this period was staggering. While Corletto was allegedly suffering in silence, McClurkin's public profile was reaching its zenith. He was performing at the Republican National Convention and appearing at campaign events for then-candidate Barack Obama. He was a kingmaker in the world of gospel, a man whose endorsement could make a career. Yet, according to the suit, back at Perfecting Faith Church, the abuse continued. Corletto recounts instances where McClurkin would secretly grope him moments before taking the pulpit. The resulting tears on Corletto's face were then allegedly weaponized by the pastor, who would point to his assistant's emotional state as a sign of the Holy Spirit's movement, encouraging the congregation to openly express emotion. The tension between Corletto's public duty and private trauma reached a breaking point in 2008. After 4 years of serving as McClurkin's shadow, witnessing the heights of gospel stardom while allegedly enduring the depths of personal violation, Corletto attempted to sever the ties. He resigned, seeking a new life away from the orbit of the Perfecting Faith Church. He eventually found a position with a major airline, hoping that physical distance and a change of scenery would provide the mental sanctuary he so desperately needed. But the lawsuit claims that McClurkin did not let go easily. Even after Corletto left his employment, the pastor allegedly continued to pursue him, utilizing the same spiritual levers he had installed years prior. Corletto describes a period of stalking and emotional guilting, where the boundaries he tried to build were systematically dismantled by a mentor who insisted that Corletto's purpose remained tied to his side. The isolation of leaving a tight-knit religious community often leaves a vacuum, and for a man who had been told his very relationship with God was mediated through his pastor, the pull of the past was overwhelming. The most harrowing encounter cited in the legal filing occurred 5 years after Corletto first tried to quit. In 2013, during a trip to Niagara Falls, the lawsuit alleges a sexual assault took place in a hotel room that shattered Corletto's remaining resolve. It was this incident that allegedly prompted the piece of evidence that has now become the focal point of the Manhattan trial, the "dirty old man" email. In the early morning hours following the alleged assault, McClurkin reportedly sat behind a screen and typed a confession that would lie dormant for over a decade. "I am the actual epitome of a desperate, dirty old man," the email allegedly read, describing a man pawning and groping a young man who is just looking for a friendship. He wrote of feeling foul and stupid, admitting he was horribly wrong for trying to force Corletto into a sexual situation to which he had consistently said no.
For Corletto, the email was a haunting artifact. At the time, however, the vindication it offered was buried under a landslide of depression. The years following the Niagara Falls incident were marked by a spiral into suicidal ideation. The weight of the secret, coupled with the ongoing struggle to reconcile his sexuality with the curse his mentor had taught him to fear, led Corletto to a suicide attempt. In the aftermath of that darkness, he did what many survivors of spiritual abuse do. He returned to the source of the trauma. He went back to the church, convinced that his straying from God was the cause of his misery, only to realize that the environment itself was the poison. The final break came shortly thereafter. Corletto cut off all contact, stepped away from the ministry, and began the agonizing process of deconstructing his faith and his history. It wasn't until 2024 that he rediscovered the 2013 email in his archives. Seeing the words in black and white, the admission of force, the acknowledgement of his no, acted as a catalyst. The fog of brainwashing finally began to lift. He realized he wasn't crazy, and he wasn't the culpable party. By the time the calendar turned to 2026, a new legal landscape in New York City provided a pathway for justice that had previously been barred by the statute of limitations. The filing on January 2nd was made possible by Introduction 1297A, a landmark amendment to the Gender-Motivated Violence Protection Law passed just months prior, in November 2025. This legislation reopened a window for survivors to sue not only their individual abusers, but also the institutions that enabled them, specifically targeting crimes of violence motivated by gender that occurred before 2022. In the Manhattan courtroom, the case has become a collision of two vastly different realities. On one side is Corletto, supported by attorney Thomas Giuffre, presenting a narrative of a decade-long grooming process that exploited a young man's faith. On the other side is Donnie McClurkin and his lead attorney Greg Lisi, who have dismissed the entire claim as a gross mischaracterization of a consensual professional mentorship. They argue that the real facts will prove the allegations are categorically false and that the interactions, some dating back 20 years, are being viewed through a distorted lens. As the discovery phase begins, the case threatens to pull back the curtain on the internal culture of Perfecting Faith Church. Corletto's legal team intends to investigate whether other staff members were aware of the behavior, pointing to allegations in the suit that complaints were made to church leadership as early as 2008 with no action taken. For the gospel community, the trial is a moment of profound reckoning. McClurkin has been the face of deliverance for a generation. If the court finds that the very man who preached against the curse of homosexuality was simultaneously preying on a young man seeking that same deliverance, it will represent one of the most significant falls from grace in modern religious history. The ripple effects of the lawsuit have extended far beyond the walls of the Manhattan Supreme Court, sending shockwaves through the global gospel community and the political circles McClurkin once navigated. In the days following the January 2nd filing, the discourse has shifted from the specific acts of the lawsuit to a broader interrogation of power, accountability, and the deliverance theology that McClurkin championed. At the center of the storm, Perfecting Faith Church remains in a state of defensive posture. While some congregants have gathered in public displays of support for their pastor, others have begun to voice concerns about the culture of silence described in the legal documents. Corletto's legal team has signaled their intent to subpoena internal church communications, specifically looking for any tolling agreements or prior internal complaints that might suggest leadership was aware of the alleged behavior years before the public filing. The defense, led by Greg Lisi, has countered with a strategy focused on the timeline and the nature of the dirty old man email. They argue that the email, if authentic, was a reflection of a moment of personal spiritual crisis and hyperbolic self-reflection, rather than a confession of criminal conduct. They maintain that Corletto's claims are a revisionist history, prompted by the current legislative environment in New York City, which has made such high-profile lawsuits more common. However, the public narrative is being shaped as much by Corletto's personal transformation as by the legal maneuvering. In recent interviews, Corletto has spoken candidly about the weight that has lifted since he stopped trying to change his sexuality. The curse he was told to break, he now says, was not his orientation, but the shame that had been weaponized against him. He describes his current life, married and living in peace, as the true deliverance he was searching for in 2003. His relationship with faith, however, remains a scarred landscape.
Corletto admits that while he still finds solace in praise and worship music, the physical act of sitting in a church service remains a trigger for the trauma he experienced under McClurkin's mentorship. He has traded a rigid religious structure for a personal spirituality, stating that in losing his religion, he finally found his family and peace. As the trial enters the midpoint of 2026, the legal world is watching closely to see how the New York City gender-motivated violence protection law will be applied to cases of spiritual grooming. If Corletto is successful, the case could set a precedent for how biblical manipulation is categorized within the framework of sexual coercion. For Donnie McClurkin, the man who once sang, "We fall down, but we get up," the climb back to public grace seems steeper than ever. The trial is no longer just about a single lawsuit. It is a referendum on the legacy of a man who built an empire on the promise of healing, only to be accused of inflicting the deepest of wounds on those who came to him for help. The story of the dirty old man email has become a cautionary tale of the duality that can exist behind the pulpit. And as the evidence continues to mount, the gospel world waits to see if the truth will finally set all parties free.